Well, welcome everybody. So you've already missed the cover slide. Now we're into Cedar Rapids. This is going to just scroll behind us, and in case you were sleeping yesterday, this is the same slide deck with a few things taken out and focused on housing, because that's what our conversation is about today. I guess we don't really need this, do we? So my name is Benjamin Alexander, and I am from Atlanta, Georgia. I used to live in Springfield, Missouri. And I actually have a relationship to all three communities represented here, Cedar Rapids, Tuscaloosa, and Joplin. Since 2005, I used to work for the Springfield Planning Department. And since 2005, I've worked as either a full-time employee for FEMA or a consultant to FEMA in disaster recovery. So my focus was not on debris or people, it was on planning and the process. And the challenge I faced was the things that you've heard, the nuggets you've heard along the way in the last day and a half, which is take the time to plan, don't make immediate decisions right away. And so my job was to coach communities and help them behind the scenes. And so, in Cedar Rapids, we did some basically shoulder holding, because it wasn't hand holding, they already knew where they were going. In Tuscaloosa was training for the federal staff that were pouring into the community and the communities, because they were spread all over from Tuscaloosa and east. And then in Joplin, it was guidance on the process. And so that's how I got involved. And Sandy was in Cedar Rapids, and unfortunately, she started just weeks before the historic flooding that occurred. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, she was with Cedar Rapids city government. But she was promoted to the assistant to the city manager just before this happened. And it's like, oh my gosh, maybe I took the wrong job. Maybe I should consider something else. And I will say, I am proud that I don't have to say that she went to the University of Iowa, because I'm an Iowa State grad. So she went to Upper Iowa University, and she is now the assistant city manager. So after being the assistant to the city manager, she survived. She wanted to stay in Cedar Rapids. And now she's the assistant city manager. So you can take that as she's a glutton for punishment, or that she is walked through that and survived very well. She's been there over 20 years, and she's dealing with a lot of the multi-million dollars that are coming in, both privately but also publicly from the federal and the state dollars, and then how they go to the various departments and how you account for all of that. Next to Sandy is Robin Edgeworth. And yesterday in a conversation I was teasing, because Walt's already today Walt Maddox has talked about the Crimson Tide. And I jokingly, and I didn't know this at the time, but I jokingly said War Eagle. And anybody who is from the South and knows that area, see, I already got a thumbs up. And Robin whipped her head around and she was like, yeah! And I didn't realize that. I was just gigging Walt. And so Robin is an alum of Auburn, and it's a very, very sensitive, tense conversation when you say Roll Tide or War Eagle. So, and I will let somebody else explain afterwards about what War Eagle means and where it came from. My synopsis is not very good. And then Robin was involved with recovery. So she started as the incident commander, as Walt just mentioned, but then she transitioned to the recovery coordinator, and she handled the recovery efforts for Tuscaloosa, and now she's taking it further, and she's going from, the initial recovery to transitioning back to day-to-day operations, so resilience long-term, and how that community recovers and basically becomes whole again as best it can. So, and then our third panelist today on housing is Troy Bolander, and is the director of neighborhood, is it neighborhood planning or planning neighborhood? Planning and development. So Troy and I worked together when I was over here supporting the Joplin effort, and that's why I wasn't supporting Tuscaloosa. I was just doing training over there because I couldn't be in two places at once. But Troy's been here over 20 years as well, and as the planning director and as a planning department, has a key role in housing. And I think you will hear all three panelists today talk about housing, whether it be short-term or long-term. And I'm going to give each of them just a brief chance to, because we're going to focus on housing, but a brief snapshot into, number one, their communities, so Cedar Rapids, Tuscaloosa, and Joplin, but also the housing issues that they faced, okay, as they dealt with those first few days and weeks and then months afterwards. So, Sandy, why don't you start and just talk about Cedar Rapids, but also the housing issues you face right away.
So Cedar Rapids, Iowa is in eastern Iowa. It's a city of about 128,000 population. It's a blue collar. Des Moines, the largest city in the state of Iowa, is insurance and financial industry based, and we're the counterpart to that, where we make lots of things in Cedar Rapids, and it was a very traditional blue collar community with very nice paying manufacturing jobs for years and years. And I mentioned yesterday we're the cereal capital of the world. We have a very strong agriculture base where we turn corn and oats into cereals and all kinds of products, pharmaceutical products and things like that. So we have a really strong economic base. We're considered the economic engine for the state of Iowa. The area that was flooded, Cedar Rapids is named after the Cedar River that runs directly in the middle of our community, and it was based on a mill town, so the entire community is built on the edge of the river. Our entire downtown sits right on the edge of the river. Also in many towns, I think, but I don't think we're unique in this, that the core neighborhoods, which end up in that same downtown, circling our downtown, have become some substandard housing, lower income housing, and that predominantly was what was damaged in our flood. So 10% of our community was flooded, all from the downtown out, about 10 square miles around our downtown that included the downtown, but in this case, most importantly, very populated neighborhoods with very modest housing, so about $60,000 to $80,000 housing values. So as you can imagine, you're affecting some residents who are in fairly unique housing, and that you can't replace it for one at that price. And yet they had pretty independent spirits, in that they wanted to live in single-family houses and had this opportunity to live in some pretty strong neighborhoods. My background, before I was promoted to assistant to the city manager 2 weeks before the flood, I had spent 8 years in the city working as our neighborhood liaison. So I worked with neighborhoods and community groups, and terrific training ground for anybody in government, I think, but it makes you remember the people that you're serving every day. What it meant for me is, one, I knew the neighborhoods really well, but it also meant that as we had those first town hall meetings right after the flood, just to let them meet FEMA and SBA and all the services, so that I knew a lot of the residents. And then you realize that if they were sitting there, they had lost their house. So pretty devastating. What we faced was, one is how do you replace housing that's not replaceable? How do you ensure that people who may or may not have the economic means to have improved housing, and how do you do it so quickly that they don't leave town? So we were stressed. We knew with the number of housing units we had in our community, we have so we're 128,000 in our total MSA, the metro area. It's about 250,000, but generally we're about 2/3 of the metro area. So there was a little bit of suburban places that weren't affected, but we're the big city, and so unlike I think we talked about yesterday, a lot of communities where you can choose some other places. Mayor Moore talked about that. We didn't have that, and with so much of our industry also affected, we really feared that if you didn't have a job, that you would see this as a sign that it's time to go somewhere else. And we certainly had people that left for a while. Luckily, our industry came back, and so our population too was lured back pretty quickly as well. But we'll get into more, I guess, about how we worked it out. But our biggest fear, we evacuated 20% of our population. We have about 45,000 housing units in Cedar Rapids, and 5,000 of those were severely damaged. We ended up acquiring through a buyout program and demolishing most of 1,400 homes in these core areas. And so making sure as we bought your house and demolished it and created a lot of new green space, so let the river breathe a little bit. that we had a place for you to go. And that loss of neighborhoods was and is still a strong issue in Cedar Rapids.
Great, thanks, Sandy. So Robin, tell us a little bit about Tuscaloosa. I think for context for everybody, Sandy brought up 120 city population and 120,000 city population, 250 MSA. So give us the same scale and we'll do the same when Troy goes.
The city of Tuscaloosa is in central western part of Alabama, and we have a population of about 100,000 people. Of course, we have a Saturday 6 or 7 times a year where we're a population of about 300,000, and Alabama decides to have a home football game. So we have disaster in and of itself about every other weekend going through the football season. I don't know that I could share any more to make real to you our disaster than what my mayor has done. I always hate when I have to speak after him because he is absolutely excellent at that and is such a genuine person when he shares those heartfelt things about our city. But you know, he says he knows the 50,000, 40,000 view, and we're supposed to know the rest. And so he really doesn't talk a lot about housing other than the impact that it had on our housing. And so I'm really excited to be able to share with you about Tuscaloosa and the things that we did that you know, are maybe a little different from other communities because we are different communities. And if for me, the one thing that I want anyone to walk out of here understanding is that what, you know, Troy needs to do in his community and what Sandy needs to do in her community and what I need to do in my community, maybe 3 different things, and that's what makes us all unique. And the people that live in Tuscaloosa do not live in Joplin. So, you know, what works for one community may or may not work in another community, but we can all figure out, you know, what things are good and what things kind of give you that general guidance that you need. And I'll be sharing more about the importance of knowing your population today, prior to a disaster. But we had about a little over 5,000 structures that were damaged or destroyed and declared uninhabitable. And so trying to define how we rehouse those people has been a challenge in Tuscaloosa, but it was one that I think we did in a very mindful process of trying to work to keep that population within Tuscaloosa. Walt shared earlier about the population of those people that were impacted, and 70% of those being rental properties. And you know, it's unfortunate that we could not show you pictures of the before those rental properties, because when you look at those and you say, okay, this is where they were living today, how do we rehouse that person? You know, you can almost think some of those, if you just had a simple tent and could throw it up, they would be in about the same place they were in some of the rental properties they were in. He shared that they had a median income of about $25,000, and I tried to remind him to add one important piece, and that is a household income of less than $25,000. So trying to rehouse the really low-income individuals presented a very huge challenge that I'll look forward to sharing with you some details in just a minute.
And Troy, tell us a little bit about Joplin and its housing impacts.
Well, I hope all of you got to see Joplin. If you went out into the area, you can tell it as a tornado occurred, the trees are gone. That's the most noticeable thing, even though we've had a lot of redevelopment occur. But EF5 tornado started on the west side of town, is where it started, and stayed on the ground and traveled through Joplin. Sometimes it was 3/4 of a mile wide and just destroyed everything. It got more powerful as it stayed on the ground, which is unusual. I come from Kansas. Familiar with tornadoes, but usually they're on the ground just for a little bit, skip and jump, and not much damage up there in the rural areas. So this is very unusual. Over $2 billion in property losses. Of course, I'm sure you heard yesterday we lost 161 lives. So it was a major event for Joplin. As far as housing, we have some of the same challenges as Cedar Rapids. Even though it hit all income levels, it did hit a part of our town that had lower income. And a lot of those homes were lost for between $50,000 and $80,000. And it's so difficult to rebuild that housing stock. It's almost impossible unless you have some type of instead of a program to help. Because those homes are affordable because of aging condition. Let's face it, they're older part of town, and you just can't build them back. Some neighborhoods were upwards almost 80% rental, 51% were uninsured. So those were some of the challenge we had, and we had to develop programs to help those citizens.
So one of the things I asked them as we were talking before the session was, tell everybody up front what your 3 main points are. What can you walk away with so you understand? And so I'm going to go and ask each of them their 3 main points quickly. And I'm going to start with Robin. So tell us the 3 main points that you want these folks to take away, and then we'll dig deeper into what those mean.
Well, the first thing, and again, I'm speaking for Tuscaloosa, and I think my points are going to be pretty valid across the board on this. And the first thing is understanding your population and your housing needs prior to any disaster. And I challenge my staff every day, and we're a government. I don't know how many of you are from local or state government, but you kind of get in that, someone asks you a question, you don't know the answer, and it's like, I don't have the answer to that, so you walk away and never give it another thought. And I try to encourage my staff, when someone asks you a question, don't say, local government shouldn't try to figure out the answer to that. Let's figure out why we don't know the answer, and if it's something that we should know, let's work to gain that a little knowledge. Let's build up our capacity in any question that comes to City Hall. So prior to the storm, one thing that we had been working on for about 4 years was understanding housing within Tuscaloosa and the needs of housing. So for Tuscaloosa, we had issues prior to the storm in regard to housing people. So if someone came to City Hall and said, here's my income, I don't know where to live, can you help me? The easy answer is, we're not realtors, we don't help you find housing, but have a nice day, and if we can ever be of assistance to you again, come see us. And so we tried to begin working outside of the box and thinking of understanding what those housing needs are prior to our disaster. And so not knowing we were going to have to face a bigger issue. So understand your housing needs prior to a disaster. I guess there's an assumption if you're not here because you haven't had a disaster, I could tell you from a lot of my training, if you go to a training on how to get ready for a disaster, look out. Yeah. Don't assume you'll never have that, but each day, probably in your community, you have that need. Even though there's no disaster, you have a need to answer that question of what are the needs within your community in regard to housing. The next piece of that is understanding what housing stock is available and trying to keep that database up to date. I have laughed and told my staff, there's like, every town has them. I don't care if you're probably 300 people to millions. There are those people within your community that have housing that is falling in, but those people call you. If you're at City Hall, they call and say, my landlord, my toilet hadn't flushed and he won't do anything about it. Well, I can't really help them deal with their landlord in most cases, but I can know who their landlord is. And while I know who he might be and would never want anyone to go there, he may be the person I have to go to during a disaster. So understanding who those people are within your community that have that housing stock, understand what they have available, try to keep that database. And then during a disaster, the third point that I would make is, how do you blend those two? How do you look at the needs? How do you look at available and blend those two? And that's what we were able to do quite successfully in Tuscaloosa, is to look at the housing needs that we had as a result of our storm, look at that available housing, and blend those two to quickly get people rehoused. Maybe not in their long-term housing, but in a quick solution to keep them from leaving our community.
Troy, tell us about Joplin.
Yeah,
Three main points.
Yeah, well, our major concern, of course, was population loss. And so one of our first mission was to get temporary housing in here quickly. We had several thousand people without homes. In fact, at this university, it's housed the homeless shelter, while we could find housing. The temporary housing, we had a large tract of land north of town, which helped shorten that time frame for the Corps of Engineers and FEMA to put in temporary housing. I think it was 31 days. We had the first temporary housing unit here, which was record time. They had originally told us we'll get housing in, granted this is May, we'll get housing in before frost. Well, that's October. We told there's no way you're going to do that. So we pushed them to get it in as quick as they could. It was 31 days. So I think that helped. When people have housing, you have to meet the basic needs, or else they're going to leave. And I agree with Robin. You have to know the housing data. I think that's where we missed the boat. We did not keep track of a lot of our existing housing stock. We had some single-family homes converted to apartments, especially in our older area, and we didn't keep track of that. So trying to recreate that data after disaster is very difficult. I mean, we actually went from photograph to photograph of what we had before and tried to guess. We talked to utility companies to see how many meters they had in the house. And after disaster, it's not time to do that. And so that was a concern we had. Probably the third thing, you really need to target your housing programs, especially for your specific needs. Like I said, we had it impacted all income levels. The challenge was getting those people who lost their $50,000, $80,000 home back into a home, or at least into an apartment. That was always the challenge, and it still is today. So you need to find out what your needs are after disaster. Have that baseline before, and find out your needs, what they are after disaster, and target your programs to meet those needs.
So 2 different communities, 2 types of disasters in terms of scale, but some common themes are starting to emerge. So Sandy, you're in a flooded community. They're in tornadoes. So tell us about your 3 main points.
Yeah, the one thing I've noticed, different disasters, and we kind of interesting to talk about the difference in a flood and a tornado. I was reflecting with Beth Freeman yesterday. She was living in our community at the time of the flood, working for Senator Harkin. Was everywhere, and we were in we had a council meeting. Our city hall was flooded. And so we were out at our community college campus, like not unlike this, having our council meeting a couple weeks after the flood. The housing is, turned upside down completely. The water stayed up for about 5 days. Minot, which is way flatter, stayed up way longer. Hearing that story, I thought 5 days was really long. So you can imagine the condition of the housing. So there were people who talked about a tornado where your house is gone versus your rotting house is sitting there. So there's a little difference, and I think a lot of it is, hard on people in different ways. But the insurance issue becomes very real as well. And some person who was a very angry citizen, of which we, of course, see many, there was a tornado siren went off during the council meeting. So we all leave the council, the auditorium, and go into this hallway, and this guy sits there and says, I hope a tornado hits to take out the flood area, because at least then my insurance will pay. And, it's those kinds of things that you sit there and go, oh my God, don't, all those things. So flood insurance, guess what? It's a really good idea. If you don't have any, get some, and encourage your residents to get flood insurance. As we kind of talked a little, I think it was already mentioned a little bit, that, Tori, you mentioned this, we got help to people because it's a national disaster and it's declared. I'd say here 8 years later, person with flood insurance, the person without, probably not a huge difference. If you had really good flood insurance, it's certainly different today. But in those first days, I would talk to people at these meetings and say, how are you so calm? And the guy looked at me and he went, I was very well insured. Most people in these neighborhoods were not. I think we had less than 30% of our the population had flood insurance, and so they had nothing. I mean, their homeowners insurance, if they had it, may have covered sewer backup. $5,000 was probably the claim that they were able to make. So those certainly people with flood insurance got into housing sooner. So that was one, was that difference of people and the immediate needs that I think have been mentioned quite a bit, and those are absolutely the case. The other thing for us was a big deal was, okay, so my house is sitting there, it's, I mean, in some cases turned upside down. I think we demolished without, kind of the emergency demolition without permission kind of stuff, about 90 homes within, weeks, because they were in the roads and all of those kinds of things. And so we took those out very quickly. Then the rest, they're private property, and so you had to figure out what somebody wanted to do with it. And we ended up in a kind of a blighted house versus a buyout situation. And we were accurately, sadly, told it will take 3 years to get buyout funds. And we thought that was crazy. I mean, we really sat there and thought, you cannot be serious. How do you buy out a house 3 years later, And it was absolutely accurate information. I mean, within a month or 2 or 3 years is when we got our buyout money from CDBG. So how do you keep people around? How do you keep them engaged? How do you keep them, sane? And we created programs immediately that, with all the temporary, we had FEMA trailers in very quickly, a lot of apartments, every apartment rented up, a lot of doubling up, and all those kinds of things to keep people in the community. The second thing we did was create a program. We had a local option sales tax vote passed for flood recovery that allowed that, we're talking general fund money, that good spendable cash. And we created an interim mortgage assistance program. And that's what we figured out was the difference between a person who could live and pay the rent, pay on a new mortgage if they could get into a new house, and keep their house from going into foreclosure, a damaged house. And so we created an interim mortgage assistance program that was very well funded and that kept people knowing that they could keep both kind of things going afloat. Where am I living today? But at my house that is still sitting there that I haven't made a decision on, am I going to try to rebuild it? Is it going to have to be demolished? Am I going to sell it to the city? Am I going to sell it to, and a few of them sold it to the guy walking down the block that said, I'll give you $5 grand for it. And the people took that. It was devastating. We ended up doing a buyout program with 107% of pre-flood assessed value. So those people that sold, it was very sad. They were not obviously eligible. The homeowner was not eligible. And then other programs. I'd say our key takeaway was that you had to fill the gap. As we talked about, these are houses that are irreplaceable. Not that you'd want that house back. I mean, they were not good. In a lot of cases, not good housing. And how do you fill all of the gaps? And there were so many. And we also emphasized that you will never be whole again. And how do you have that same message? I'm going to try to get you into a house that you can afford, that's safe and quality, and of where you want to be, but you're still going to have loss. And, so working through those were also huge issues there.
So as you think about long-term solutions, and that's part of this program, some of the things that they have already mentioned, and 2 of them are consistent across all 3 panelists, is that those actions that you take so that you are prepared are very important. And I will say one thing right now that all 3 panelists have said, that it's not directly, but the insurance issue, when you have less than 30% of the people had flood insurance in Cedar Rapids, 50%, of one population that's in a rental market doesn't have insurance, I would say one strong takeaway is for each of you to go back and check your insurance, okay? Personally. Now, organizationally, go back and make sure you're prepared to understand the issues of whatever field that you work in. Emergency management, planning, city administration, charity, doesn't matter. Understand those needs, because that's what we've just heard. Not knowing the needs was a challenge. Not knowing the issues was a challenge. And people being either underwater or not having enough protection did not allow them enough security post. So we're not even halfway through, and that's a lesson to take away. So
I have one comment to that.
Certainly.
One of those, we have many nonprofits flooded, many churches, lots of nonprofits, a lot of cultural institutions, and as you get through the program, you realize the limited assistance that's available to them. So flood insurance in their case became a really big issue, and we were trying to figure out why were some nonprofits coming back really well, and some were saying can't survive it. You know, the nonprofit closes, and the difference was if you have a member of your board who is in the insurance industry, those groups all had flood insurance, and they were able to survive. And in some cases, we have some large insurance companies in our town, so and they are very community leaders. And so if you had a United Fire board member on your nonprofit board, you were more likely to survive this successfully.
The cobbler's children go barefoot. I hear it all the time. Check your insurance policy personally, then work to understand the needs from your organization's perspective. Know those up front. So I'm going to come back to data because we've talked about needs. Several folks have mentioned needs, and Troy actually mentioned the word data to understand that. I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to ask you a quick question about character. So all these areas, whether they were working class, low to moderate, higher income, they had a sense of character to them, a neighborhood, a sense of place. Talk to the group just quickly about how you dealt with restoring the character, because getting a person in their home and getting a new home built doesn't necessarily translate to achieving the same character. So I'll start with Troy, if you jump in.
Well, that's always a challenge when all the home's just gone. I see a citizen here. She was her neighborhood leader to make sure that neighborhood came back. We had many people who wanted to move back to that neighborhood and took the charge of creating that sense of neighborhood. So we couldn't have done it without it. Also, we incentivize people to move back to the recovery area. As you can imagine, if everything gone, it was a blighted area. Who would want to move back to that unless you just wanted to move back into that area yourself? We created what's called the JHAP program. It's a home buyers assistance program. And the purpose of it was to encourage home ownership in those areas, especially those areas that had 80% rental. They weren't coming back at all. And I never wanted to call myself a social planner, but that's what we were doing. We were encouraging homeowners to come to a neighborhood that was previously a rental situation to stabilize those neighborhoods. And God forbid if this happened again, those homes typically come back a little quicker. So yeah, that's a challenge. I mean, neighbors move back, some of them don't. They're wondering, is my neighbor moving back? Do I want to move here if no one else is coming back? So it took a while for some people to process that and come back. And of course, we had to help incentivize that.
Sandy, you had some distinct community or neighborhoods, even some ethnic neighborhoods that were very challenging. Talk about getting that character and bringing that back.
Yeah, again, those core neighborhoods, they did have long roots. Luckily, I knew I had some history because of that previous work I had done in neighborhoods. We had it was probably 40-50% rental. The reason it was kind of that low, it's not low, but is because that everybody owned their own house there, and then they bought other houses. And it was in the early 2000s during when low interest rates started that these houses are so priced so low, they decided to pick their neighbors by buying the house across the street and down the way, and then there was, a child would move into one of the houses, that kind of thing. So these huge family units in these smaller low income houses, which meant I had one neighborhood leader who lost 9 houses in the flood, and not a slumlord, a person who really they bought their houses to protect their neighborhood, and build their own neighborhoods. Very difficult. I think we were able to right away. We had unsuccessfully had a housing program before the flood, where we had a speculator that had bought up a ton of property in the south part of our downtown, and we bought that all from him, trying to do this kind of infill, a core neighborhood infill program. We couldn't get builders to build these stick-built houses of 130,000. Nobody was interested. There's plenty of cornfields to build houses on. So why would I come into the inner city, and deal with all those issues? Narrow lots, lower housing values, not as much profit, and all of those things. So we had the program all developed. No biters. Well, guess what? That's the first land we went to when we did get those CDBG dollars in for a housing program working with the state of Iowa. So we had lots available. So we thought it'd go right there. Well, immediately the builders said, I have a subdivision on the side of town that I got, and I'm ready to go here, and I know what my profit margin is, and now you're offering this down payment assistance. Guess where I'm putting people? Out on the outside skirts of town. We did our first round that way, very quickly realized our mistake in not incentivizing or requiring building in the core of our neighborhoods, because what we realized is, we had a lot of people that I knew that moved, that bought those first houses. The people I knew were kind of the community leaders. They're the decisive ones who were ready to go, move right away. And they got out there and they said, this is not the same. Core neighborhoods are not the same as suburban neighborhoods. And they didn't like it. They didn't know their neighbors. They didn't know who people were. And they really had a sense of loss. And so what we realized quickly was we needed to require building in the core neighborhoods. And we've done fantastically some of the most beautiful housing in the core neighborhoods that were flooded, because our flood was so far outside the floodplain that, we have what we call neighborhood revitalization areas. We had greenway areas that we don't, that we bought the properties and are not going to rebuild in, but we had these great neighborhoods. The Mother Mosque of America is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the first mosque built in North America as a standalone building. There were many mosques, imagine on the East Coast, that they were always part of another building. The Lebanese families that moved to Iowa in the early 1900s, both Christian and Muslim, moved to town, built the Christian church for the Lebanese, and then all the Lebanese Christians came over and helped the Muslims build the Mother Mosque of America. So we have this fantastic history. Their Mother Mosque was damaged in the flood, but not destroyed, and so there's some great pictures of the neighborhood and the community coming to the Mother Mosque's aid as well. So those neighborhoods, the other cool program I would say that really does address that issue of, I lived in this neighborhood for a reason, and it's because I liked that neighborhood feel, was the program I mentioned yesterday called Block by Block. Matthew 25 is an organization created by one of our Methodist churches. These brothers, these young pastors who came in and said, they're truly social workers, and got some private donations and started building, rehabbing houses, building some new, but mostly rehab, filled in kind of the missing teeth on some of our revitalization blocks, and then required neighborhood building. You had to attend neighborhood association meetings. Everybody had roles in so they created these neighborhood associations as they rebuilt their blocks. And it was so fun to go to those, the first anniversary of some of their blocks being rehabbed, that you would have thought those neighborhoods were old. You would have thought that the neighbors had been there for a long time. They had done in a year what some neighborhoods can't do in 20 years to build community. They were so proud, helping each other, and had beautiful homes as a result. And they got commitments from the people who were staying on those blocks as well. They were so happy to see their neighborhood come back. They could have been sitting there among vacant lots. They realized the risk and embraced this new idea, and got some great neighbors and neighborhoods.
Robin, how did you, Robin probably tried to sprinkle a little bit of blue and orange amidst all the crimson, but how did you deal with the character issues in Tuscaloosa and retaining some of those neighborhoods or some of those housing stock?
In Tuscaloosa, I think in Walt's PowerPoint or Prezi, he showed you the path of our storm, and it's kind of interesting. On the anchor of the western and eastern side, you had those were just plagued with low income, extremely low income, and also extremely high crime rate. And since there's no one here from Tuscaloosa, and I just hope whatever we're videoing doesn't make its way to Tuscaloosa, I'll say, it's very unfortunate, the loss of lives. It's very unfortunate that you have a disaster. It's very unfortunate that people were out of their homes. They lost so much. But if you said, okay, we really need, if the federal government or someone rode into town with a wagon full of money and said, okay, we have this money and we want you to do a revitalization program, pick your communities you want to do it in, that west side and that eastern side would have probably been the two areas that we would have said, okay, those two need it. So while our disaster happened, It was really bad. It claimed lives. It also impacted communities that were really, really needing that extra shot in the arm. So trying to regain the character of those neighborhoods, we really were trying to not regain, but create new character. And so rehousing the people that live there, which might be grandmother who was an excellent citizen, but 9 granddaughters and grandsons that came and either lived with her when they couldn't find who else they wanted to live with, or, you know, and they brought with them their friends who stayed overnight, and basically grandmother was just being pushed out of her home, and they were bringing with them the criminal element. Trying to figure out how to rehouse grandmother was very important to us, but even deeper than that was trying to get grandmother to understand that you are bringing, every time you do this, you're not doing any good for your grandson. When he comes to visit and he comes and does crime within your home, within that neighborhood, you are destroying your home, you're destroying your neighborhood. So let's help grandmother understand what she needs to do, and let's figure out where grandson really needs to be, and what we need, what programs need to support him to get him away from the criminal element. So we tried to build not just how do we house people, but how do we house them in addition to addressing sometimes mental health issues and criminal issues and things of that nature. So we had, in the center part of our path of the storm was where most of our professors from the University of Alabama, where they live. And so there really was almost the center part of our city where we could back up and say, you know, they're going to figure it out. We don't have to spend a huge amount of time. They're going to be the ones that were really well insured. If they were not, shame on them. They can, you know, they're smart people. They can figure this out. But we have these other areas that we do have to figure out. So trying to bring back the character of neighborhood was really trying to create a character that made that neighborhood more desirable to live in, and that would create, it was rental property. So trying to figure out how do we get those people who need to rent back in homes that they can afford. And I shared last night with someone that was talking about housing. You know, when someone says, okay, I was only paying $200 a month, help me find something. You know, there are times you have to say, unfortunately or fortunately, whichever, public housing may be where you really need to be. You may be the person that public housing is designed for, because if you can rent a house for $200 a month in the city of Tuscaloosa, there's something wrong. We have too many students. We have 35,000 students who are living, well, if they're your children and they're coming to Alabama, we thank you for the Mercedes you send them there in, and the $1,500 a month condo you probably have them in. But, you know, the students are there, so they are going to be renting. You know, the average student is looking for those houses and rental properties that are being just consumed by them. And then you have these people that we're trying to find housing for, that really public housing may be the way they need to go, at least for an interim period. One thing I'll share that just shows you how different communities are. Troy talked about, and Sandy did, about the FEMA trailers. The city of Tuscaloosa absolutely would not allow a FEMA trailer in Tuscaloosa. We did not have one trailer, would not do that. That was like, that will be the thing of last resort, because we had available housing stock. So the key is knowing before the event what you have and utilizing that, because I don't know if Joplin or Cedar Rapids or anywhere else had this problem, but I know the nature of the people that we were going to be placing in that housing, and FEMA trailers are temporary. So sometimes in the process we looked at times you're kicking the can down the road. That is not to say that is not what you need to do for your community. For Joplin, that was what they needed, and it worked well for them. For Tuscaloosa, it grew from, and they had available land to do it on. Tuscaloosa, we don't have a huge piece of property to create this housing with all of these trailers. So what we would have been looking at is someone having a FEMA trailer on the lot that they owned. Well, you know, when you live in that trailer and you've been living in a rundown house to begin with, suddenly you're going to imagine when you get in that trailer. So you're living there, that loses somewhere in the process, and I guess if you called them every day and reminded them, they're still going to forget it by the end of the day, that housing is temporary. Let's be figuring out what's next for you. I'm perfectly comfortable. I'm staying right here. I'm on my land Grandmama gave me when she died 50 years ago, and we're here, so we like where we are. Okay. So that was part of our reasoning. Secondly, the city of Tuscaloosa does not allow mobile homes within our jurisdiction. So we were then faced with, if we allow them, we're violating our own code. And once probably not anywhere else, your people probably don't do this, but if you ever let Sally do something, you can rest assured Sally's whole kindred, they're all going to want to do the same thing. So for us, it was, we have available housing stock, and we knew that prior. So how do we begin housing these people without using the FEMA trailers? And that worked for us. That may not work for you. But I think, you know, I think the good thing of hearing three different people share what works for us. We did create housing programs where we did down payment assistance programs. We partnered with Habitat for Humanity. We did a lot of different really unique things to encourage rebuilding within our recovery area. The dollars, we strictly, that path on that map that Walt showed you, that is the path that we followed and said you build within this, you get these incentives, and that worked. But one thing that I think is important to take away from this is every disaster is not a federally declared disaster. And my brain, what little bit I have left, tells me that you are going to see fewer and fewer federally declared disasters. When I think Walt spoke yesterday about, well, no, it was in our smaller group where we had people come in and share with us how much money you're going to get, Tuscaloosa, you're going to get, and he always says, they said the B word, and the B word is billions. You're going to get $1 billion. Well, suddenly you start thinking, oh, wow, okay, we could do this, and you begin to have expectations of what you can do, and when those billions don't come, and people were comparing us at that point to New Orleans. Oh, you've got all of this, and New Orleans got this amount, you'll get this amount. And that didn't happen. And then we had a tornado in 2014 that was around $1 million of damage to homes, and we got 0 individual assistance dollars. It was a federally declared with 0 individual assistance dollars. So, you know, all disasters are not created equal. I think they're talking about that in one of the other sessions. But, you know, preparing and trying to figure out your plan absent federal dollars, that is challenging. That is challenging. And, you know, I know near where I live, it was a small community, and we heard from a village yesterday in one of our small groups that was affected and lost. There were 300 plus homes there. After their disaster, they had 100, and you know, that's probably not when you have even your whole village destroyed, or your whole little town destroyed, or your community. Sometimes the dollar amount doesn't reach the federal threshold, so you're not, while your whole town may be gone, you didn't get that declaration that you really needed. So understanding what you can do absent federal dollars is really important, and I believe that ties back to understanding your existing housing stock.
Sure. Go.
Good the same. So in 2008, I'll show you, 2014, in June 2 years ago, we had flash flooding, so different than river flooding. All of a sudden rain deluge and the storm sewers all back up. And we had about 54 houses that were severely damaged or destroyed from overland water. And same thing, we have public assistance through that disaster declaration. So we had roads washed out and things like that, and sewers that we were able to get assistance for, but no individual assistance, no CDBG dollars coming in for that. And I will tell you, that's like for a whole nother conference of a community that has had a disaster that's nationally declared to one that is not. Just think of the people who are coming into our council chambers then and saying, but the same thing happened to me that happened to that person, 6 years before, and you provided them all of these things. And we even provided a personal possessions program out of that sales tax, the local dollars. We gave $10,000 for kind of whatever you need. We gave some of those special, what I would call really very special and unique funds, and we were able to give these people nothing. They had the $5,000, state of Iowa fund if they were income eligible. It was all the money, and I'll tell you, their houses were just as destroyed. Their basements were caved in, and that. I kept thinking, before that we'd had those kinds of things happen, but the community had never experienced the glutton of federal dollars coming in, and now they were able to contrast it, and it feels vastly unfair. And our city council members struggled with how can we do this to people? How do you say no when we kept saying yes and yes and yes? And I need the book on that one because I don't think we're through all that.
So I think one of the things that they've portrayed very well is knowing what to borrow, because you cannot apply a tornado to a flood, and you cannot apply one community to another, because the states have different guidelines and different responsibilities and different approaches. We already heard about trailers for temporary housing units placed in a community on vacant land versus on lots. Those decisions are done locally, so you need to know, and each of these folks know, but you as members of the audience need to know what is appropriate to borrow, and you need to hold your state and federal and or tribal leaders accountable, not just to bring, hey, I worked in Cedar Rapids, this is what we're going to do in Tuscaloosa, or this is what we're going to do in Joplin, because it doesn't work, it doesn't fit, and that's an important takeaway. The other thing that I heard from them was leadership, having that neighborhood leadership, those roots, as Sandy said, gave some stability and brought back, the face-to-face. I think we were talking about, Robin talking about the grandmother, and having that presence of that stabilizing presence in a community, so you could address some of the unstable elements, whether it be criminal or just a loss of space or neighbors until they return. So knowing that's part of the knowing, and then the right programs. You have the JHAB program here in Joplin and the Block by Block in Cedar Rapids. Having the right program in place that serves you. Don't just say, oh, well, Joplin did this, well, we're going to put this in XYZ community. Well, it may not work. It may not be politically available. It may not be fiscally available or responsible. So those are a couple of things that I heard here. We've got about 7 minutes. So I want to jump into quickly, because I want to hear some questions too. Tell us, and this will be really quick, tell us one positive thing that happened, but also tell us one, like a lesson learned. Tell us a hindsight. Sometimes you learn more from that woulda, coulda, shoulda. So I'll start with, let's start with Troy, and then we'll wrap around. So one positive and one woulda, coulda, shoulda.
Well, what you need to do is develop your relationships prior to the disaster. I mentioned our JHAB program, which is just our local government program, but there are many others involved. It's a team effort when it comes to building housing, rehabbing housing. I mean, we had a faith-based community. We had a lot of our nonprofits, Habitat for Humanity, Economic Security Corporation, which is community action committee, our group, and we had that in place because we're such a small community. We knew those people. I mean, the very next day we got on the phone to the Habitat director and say, hey, can you do this for us? Well, sure, I'll do that. We went to the Housing Authority and said, hey, can you do this? Sure. So we had those relationships developed. So that's, if I can get something across out of this meeting, is develop those relationships, because it's too late to create them. It's volunteers and neighbors. I mean, we have a realtor here, the top realtor in town. She volunteered her time and talent to make sure that happened. So please develop those relationships. One thing that we were probably didn't do a good job is keeping data on our housing stock. We didn't know what we lost, and we had to go back and recreate that. And that is such a pain to do. It takes time and effort, and it probably delayed us implementing some of our housing programs. So all I can say is keep track of your housing data. That changes all the time. In fact, after the disaster, we did a market housing analysis annually for the next 4 years, because it kept changing. It changes that quick.
And what were you doing market analysis prior to the storm? How often were you doing that?
Oh, probably once every 2 years.
Say, so you better handle on that.
Yeah.
So Sandy, give us a positive lesson, but also woulda, coulda, shoulda on hindsight.
I just have to comment, we had just changed forms of government 2 years before the flood. We were in the commission form of government, which is, I don't know, it's a little odd. 5 elected administrators / elected leaders by jurisdiction. We had just changed in 2006. And so the housing market analysis was part of the first city manager coming into town and saying, here's some things you have not done, you know? And so we were well positioned. You know, I've heard too, the trajectory you're on at the time of a disaster is where you go. So if you're up, you know, and thank goodness we were in this great building phase with the new form of government. But that leads to the program, I'd say the really great thing, program development. We had some terrific staff members as an entitlement city through CDBG. You know, we had just, I think, some of the most fantastic planning staff and housing staff who did have some of the data that we were focusing on. Like I said, we had that program that was called Housing and Neighborhood Development Hand Program. So we had done all the work on it, just didn't get the bite, you know, from the builders. Well, all that information helped us. We have planners that developed our programs in 45 days, and you know, some of them have moved on because guess what? It's, I said flood years are like dog years, you know, like 1 year of experience is worth 5 or more. And they went on to some really good jobs across the country, and well deserved because, you know, plus you just can't do that forever. But did some really, really huge, really good program development with the data that we had, and I think it was very successful. I'd say our biggest issue that we really have finally addressed is communications, and I know that's just such a all-encompassing word. We had in the city of Cedar Rapids, we had decentralized communications people. So any department that over the years could afford to have a marketing communications person had one, and then people that couldn't figure out, you know, I'll buy an engineer instead of a marketer. So Public Works didn't have anybody that knew anything about talking to people, which is bad. Engineers, you know, not being able to talk to people is not a good thing. We have a great one now. She interprets. It's great. We have since consolidated and centralized our communications within the city, and so I have a manager and then a team of communicators, and boy have we increased our ability to communicate and engage with our residents about lots of things. And I keep thinking back, if we'd had that at the time of the flood, we didn't even have a communications central person out of the city manager's office. We hired that person 5 days, I think, after the flood. We were in the interview process because, you know, just like, you know, a friend from Minot said yesterday, you know, I needed the FAQ. We hand-delivered newsletters to every household. We put them on the front of houses in this area, hand-delivered twice a week, 3 times a week. We had volunteer groups that would do that. We had a faith-based group called Serve the City that, you know, hours, thousands of hours, hand-delivering them because we did know our library was devastated, which means you didn't go to the library and look it up on the internet. You know, you didn't even have a place to go to do that kind of thing. So we had a cadre of communications people from those nonprofits that really did come together and serve us very well. But man, how much better could it be? And how much better is our communication now in finding people that needed things and be able to provide those. That communications plan is so big because you can have all the great programs in the world and be all ready to go. And if nobody knows you're there and what you have, it doesn't even matter.
So what's a positive action that Tuscaloosa took, and then what's something you look back and say, gosh darn, wish we would have done this?
Well, our positive is the fact that we did have the housing data, and we had available housing stock and had that to merge the two to really be successful in rehousing people. Just to kind of give you a little, if you're sitting thinking on how to even begin that process, I'll just tell you a couple little tidbits that might make it easier depending on the size of your community. But if you're fortunate enough, I can't say we were fortunate in this regard, but if your local post office, you know, they know where they deliver the mail to every day, and they have that data, maybe, that's a great place to begin. If they happen to have it, then you are really far into what you need to know, because they know that no one lived in that house and hasn't lived there in 10 years. So when you're beginning to rehouse, you're not thinking, okay, we've got to find out where these people went. Where did they go? We can't find